You've learned about events, states, component composition, and other important React topics, features, and concepts. But aside from capturing user events, we haven't yet covered how to capture text input and input via other form elements, like input, text area, and option. And that is exactly what we're going to be doing today. This lesson, we're going to explore the various ways of working with form. We'll also look at creating forms and form elements in React. And the objectives for today's lesson will be to define forms and form elements, then unpack capturing data changes and using references to access data. We'll then move on to exploring alternative approaches for capturing user input data from form elements. And then finally, analyzing setting default values for form elements. And your challenge for Lesson 5 was to read up on the different types of events that you can use in web application. And you probably found many different types. For example, events can also be any of these. The user chooses a key on the keyboard. The user resizes and closes the browser window. A web page finishes loading, or a form is submitted. In React, when you're working with forms or any other user input fields, such as standalone text fields or buttons, you have an interesting problem to solve. According to the React website, React components must represent the state of the view at any point in time, not only at the initialization. React is all about keeping things simple by using declarative style to describe UIs. React describes the UI end stage, basically what it should look like. In traditional HTML form elements, the states of elements change with user input, but React uses a declarative approach to describe UIs. Input needs to be dynamic to reflect the state properly. Thus, opting not to maintain the component state in JavaScript and not to sync it with the view adds problems. There may be a situation when the internal state and the view are different. React won't know about the changed state. This can lead to all sorts of trouble and bugs and negates React's simple philosophy. The solution is to keep React's render as close to the real DOM as possible. Working with forms is paramount to web development because they allow your applications to receive data, like text, and actions, like clicks, from the user. In this lesson, we'll refer to pretty much everything that we've covered so far, and you'll begin to see how everything fits together. When defining a form and its events in React, you need to start with the form element. Typically, you don't want input elements to be hanging around randomly in the DOM. This situation can turn bad if you have many functionally different sets of inputs. Instead, you wrap input elements that share a common purpose in form element. Having a form wrapper isn't required. It's fine to use form elements by themselves in simple UIs. In more complex UIs, where you may have multiple groups of elements on a single page, well then it's wise to use form for each such group. React's form is rendered like an HTML form, so whatever rules you have for the HTML form will apply to the React's form element too. For example, according to the HTML5 spec, you should not use nest forms. The form element can have events. React supports 3 events for forms, in addition to the standard React DOM events. These are onChange, which fires when there's a change in any of the form's input elements. OnInput, which fires for each change in text area input element values, but the React team doesn't recommend using this. OnSubmit fires when the form is submitted, usually by pressing enter. In addition to the 3 events already listed, form can have standard React events like onKeyUp and onClick. Using form events may come in handy when you need to capture a specific event for the entire form. For example, it helps you provide a good UX if you allow users to submit data when they press enter, assuming they're not in a text area field, in which case enter would create a new line. You can listen to the form submit event by creating create an event listener that triggers this .handle submit, like this. Note that you need to implement the handle submit function outside of render, just as you would with any other event. And here are 2 things to remember. React doesn't require a naming convention, so you can name the event handler however you wish, as long as the name is understandable and somewhat consistent. And the other thing is, don't invoke a method or use parentheses, and don't use double quotes around curly brackets when setting the event handler. So let's talk about defining form elements. We implement almost all input fields in HTML with just 4 elements: input, text area, select, and option. Do you remember that in React, properties are immutable? Well, form elements are special because users need to interact with the elements and change these properties. For all other elements, this is possible. React made these elements special by giving them the mutable properties value, checked, and selected. These special mutable properties are also called interactive properties. Here's a list of the interactive properties/fields, ones that can change, that you can read from events like onChange attached to form elements. You can read the values and change them by working with these interactive mutable properties. So let's look at some examples of how to define each of the elements. The input elements renders multiple fields by using different values for its type attribute. Text is plain text input field. Password is text input field with a masked display. Radio is radio button. Use the same name to create a group of radio buttons. Checkbox is checkbox element. Use the same name to create a group. Button is button form element. The main use case for all input type elements, except checkboxes and radio buttons, is to use value as the element's interactive or changeable property. For example, an email input field can use the email state and onChange event handler like this. The text area elements are for capturing and displaying long text inputs such as notes, blog posts, code snippets, and so on. In regular HTML, text area uses inner HTML, that is, children, for the value like this. To listen for the changes, use onChange just as you would for input elements. Select and option fields are great, UX-wise, for allowing users to select a single value or multiple values from a pre-populated list of values. The list of values is completely hidden behind the element until the user expands it. And as mentioned earlier, to capture changes to a form element, you set up an onChange event listener. This event supersedes the normal DOMs on input. In other words, if you need the regular HTML DOM behavior on input, you can use React's on input. On the other hand, React's onChange isn't exactly the same as the regular DOM onChange. The regular DOM onChange may be fired only when the element loses focus, whereas React's onChange fires on all new input. And you might be wondering what triggers onChange. Input, text area, and select. OnChange is triggered by a change in value. Input with type checkbox or radio, OnChange is triggered by a change in checked. Based on this mapping, the approach to reading the value varies. As an argument of the event handler, you're getting a synthetic event. It has a target property of value, checked or selected, depending on the element. To listen for changes, you define the event handler somewhere in your component. You can define it in inline 2, meaning the JSX's curly brackets, and create the onChange attribute pointing to your event handler. For example, this code captures changes from an email field. And interestingly, if you don't define onChange but provide value, React will issue a warning and make the element read-only. If your intention is to have a read-only field, it's better to define it explicitly by providing read-only. This will not only remove the warning, but also ensure that other programmers who read the code know that this is a read-only field by design. To set the value explicitly, set the read-only value to true. That is, read-only equals true. Or add the read-only attribute by itself without the value. The React by default will add the value of true to the attribute. Once you capture changes in elements, you can store them in the component state like this. Sooner or later, you'll need to send this information to a server on another component, and in this case, you'll have the values neatly organized in the state. For example, suppose you want to create a loan application form that includes the user's name, address, telephone number, and social security number. Each input field handles its own changes. At the bottom of this form, you'll put a submit button to send the state to the server. And this example shows the name field with onChange, which keeps all input in the state. And the output would look like this. So now we've learned how to define elements, capture changes with events, and update the state, which you use to display values. I'll tell you what, let's continue with the loan application scenario. So once a loan is approved, then the user needs to be able to type in the number of the account to which they want their loan money to be transferred. So let's implement an account field component using your new skills. This is a controlled element, which is the best practice when it comes to working with forms in React, like this. We now have an account number input field that needs to accept numbers only. To limit the input to a number from 0 to 9, you can use a controlled component to weed out all the non-numeric values. The event handler sets state only after filtering the input, but only digits are allowed as the value and in the view because the element is controlled. Render has the input field, which is a controlled component because value equals this.state.account number. Oh, and just a last word on input elements and forms. When you try out this example, you'll be able to type in only numbers because React sets the new state to the filtered number-only value. By following React's best practice for working with input elements and forms, you can implement validation and enforce that the representation is what the app wants it to be. And in our next lesson, we're going to be setting default properties for components and understanding React property types and validation. We'll learn about rendering children. We will also learn about creating higher order components for code reuse. And finally, we'll compare the presentational versus container components. Using controlled form elements is best practice, but as you've seen, this approach requires additional work because you need to manually capture changes and update states. If you define the value of the attribute's value, checked and selected using strings, properties, or states, then an element is controlled by React. And at the same time, form elements can be uncontrolled when the value attributes aren't set, neither to a state nor to a static value. Uncontrolled elements can be useful when you're building a simple form that will be submitted to the server. In other words, consider using uncontrolled pattern when you're not building complex UI element with a lot of mutations and user actions. It's pretty much a hack that you should avoid using most of the time. And typically, to use uncontrolled components, you define a form submit event, which is typically on click, on a button, and or on submit to a form. And once you have this event handler, well, then you have two options. Capture changes as you do with controlled elements, and use state for submissions, but not for values. And don't capture changes. The first approach is pretty straightforward. It's about having the same event listeners and updating the states. And that is a lot of coding if you're using the state only at the final stage. And as you've seen in React, an uncontrolled component means the value property isn't set by the React library. And when this happens, the component's internal value or state may differ from the value in the component's representation or view. Basically, there's a dissonance between internal state and representation. The component state can have some logic, such as validation, and with an uncontrolled component pattern, your view will accept any user input in a form element, thus creating the disparity between view and state. Take a look at this text input field that is uncontrolled because React doesn't set the value. Any user input will be immediately rendered in the view. To capture changes in an uncontrolled component, then you use onChange. And let's take it back to our loan application example. I don't know, I like this example. Now suppose you want the loan application to pre-populate certain fields with existing data. In normal HTML, you define a form field with value, and users can modify the element on the page. Because React uses value, checked, and selected to maintain consistency between view and the internal state of elements, you hardcore the values like this. It'll be a read-only input field, which isn't what you need in most cases. Therefore, in React, the special attribute default value sets the value and lets users modify form elements. Now let's assume if the form was saved earlier and you want to fill in the input field for the user. In this case, you need to use the default value property for the form elements. You can set the initial value of the input field like this. If you use the value attribute, value equal JSX, instead of default value, this element becomes read-only. Not only will it be controlled, but the value won't change when the user types in the input element. And this is because the value is hard-coded, and React will maintain that value. Probably not what you want. And obviously in real-life applications, you get values programmatically, which in React means using properties, or using states. And just a last word on default values. The default value React feature is most often used with uncontrolled components. But as with references, default values can be used with controlled components, or in any other scenario. You don't need default values as much in controlled components, because you can define those values in the state in the constructor. And as you've seen, most UI work is done in handy form elements. You need to make them beautiful, yet easy to understand and use. And you must also have user-friendly error messages, front-end validation, and non-trivial things like tooltips, scalable radio buttons, default values, and placeholders. And hopefully you've seen that building a UI can be complicated and can quickly spiral out of control. But fortunately, React does make the job a little easier for you by letting you use cross-browser API for form elements. And it's time to see all of this in action. Let's dive straight into our demo to show you how to create forms and capture data changes. Roll the camera, let's do it. So now I've opened up our previous project, my app, and the HTML and the elements like headings, H1, H2, or maybe paragraphs. Now they are meant to display information. On the other hand, the forms and the input elements like input, select, and text area collect information from the user. So working with form and input fields requires more effort. So we have to access input values and validate the form, and also submit the form data and handle submission results. So let's see how we can access the form input and how to validate and submit forms in React. So we'll start off from the beginning. So let me delete all of this here inside our app component. So now I want to register a form. So I'm going to make this form for a cat. So let's say there's a cat show event that's going to happen in our city, maybe. So let's implement a form to register cats for the show. So let's name the form registry or cat, and which is going to have 3 fields: name, color, and age. All right, let's code our first version of register your cat. So we're going to have functional component app, and then let's define const. And then I'm going to call these colors equal an array of colors. So the first one is white, red, blue, and black. So now after I've defined our array, I will define a function const register your cat form. And this function will return a form, and then inside this form I have two headings: register your cat. Here's the first heading, which is register your cat. And then after that, I would define a label name for our input. And this is then going to be for our input. Another label for the color, and then I will put select here for the option of the color. So here goes the select, which is the option for the color. So it's going to be select, and then inside this select I have the options. So for option, I have value equal an empty string. And then I'll close our option, and then here I will type select color. Then I will map through the colors array to put all the colors that the user can select from. So I will write colors. And then for each color, which I will refer to as C, for each color C, I need an option key equal that color. Then type for me this color C. After we're done with the second elements of the form, then I write other things like age. And I give age a label. And this is also going to be an input. So I'm just going to write these three: name, color, and age. So now I save this, and now we don't need this anymore. This is from our previous example. So what we've done here is we just defined this function called register your form. So all of this is just the function of register your cat. And now we need to return something to the component app. So what we can do is we can then write return. And then I will write out a single div. And inside that I will call this function. So here I will type this dot register your cat form. And because this is a function, I will put parentheses and then save it. And then check and refresh. Okay, so it says nothing was written from render. Now this usually means a return statement is missing. So let's go check out what we can do here. This is our return. So we need to put this return here outside these curly brackets, because this is a clause of the function over here. Let me show you. Put it outside of the curly brackets. So I will come here and then paste our return, and then save the file again, and then go back and check, and obviously refresh it. Also, I don't think that we need this because it's a functional component. So now if we have a look over here, we have our register your cat form. So here is the cat name, and then we select our colors. So we have our white, red, blue, black, and then we type our age. So again, what they've done is that this is our up component that we defined, colors array. Then we defined our function, which contains form. And then after that, we return this function as app component return element. So as you can see in the output, we have our form. There it is. Now this form doesn't actually do anything. It just displays the input fields. So the next step in the process is to access the input field values. And I'm obviously going to show you how to do that. So the user has introduced data into the input. But how do we access this value inside the React component? Well, as I mentioned before, React offers two approaches to access the value of an input field. The first one is using controlled component, and the other one is using uncontrolled component. So as I said, we preferred controlled component because we can read and set the input value through the component state. So let's take a look at an example of control component in React. So what we can do is define our state const name. And set name equal use state. And we'll do the same thing for the color and age. So copy this, and then do the same thing for color and age. Here it's going to be color and then set color, and then age and then set age. So now what we have to do is we have to define the event handler. So what we can do is we can define const name handler equal. Then receive an event, and then return set name event dot target dot value. Dot target dot value. And the same for age and for color. So I will copy this and then paste it here, and then again over here. So this is going to be color handler. It's going to take set color, and this is going to be age handler, and then set age. Now I have to go to each input field in our form to define the value and the onChange. So I would start by the name, and inside the input I will type value equal our state, which here is name, and then onChange equal our event handler for the name, which is name handler. So it's going to be name handler. Again, I will go to the select and I will type value equal color and onChange equal color handler. And it's the same thing for age. Value equal age, onChange equal age handler. So now I will save the file, and then before I check, I would like to make sure that I import useState with React. And then I'll save the file. All right, so let's go check if we get an error here. Okay. So it says the use state is not defined. So let's try. Let's check and refresh. So selector is not defined, line 14. So we go back to our application and then we go take a look at line 14, which is set color. Ah, yes, because it's a capital over here. And then let's also make sure that age is also capital. And then once again, save the file. And make sure the name is the same. So here we have a handler, and again also here color handler, and then same for the name. So it's name handler. All right, so everything is perfect. This should work. Yes, perfect. All right, so now if I save this and then check the browser, everything should work just fine. So now what's happening here is we set an event handler or change handler to each field of the form. So the name handler returns a handler that updates the value of my property, which change in the name field immediately. And it's the same thing for value of age and of the color. All right, so now I can type any name for my cat. And then with color, when I choose red, it should be red instead of select color. Okay, so let's see what we did here. Yes, we write the change of value and the event handler in the select. And this should, instead of that, it should be of value in option, because we're changing our option. So now if we save this and then check the browser again, and then select any color, it should be written here instead of that. And now this is the way that we write control form in React. So now we have the form's data stored in the component state. We can send the form value to the server. But before doing that, how to be sure that the user has introduced all the required information? Well, for this, we need to perform the form validation. Using HTML form validation invokes making the input field with the special attributes. For example, required marks the input field as required. So let's mark the input as required for completion of name, color, and age. And the way that we do that is by adding this attribute to our input field. So here in the input field, let's add more attributes. So I can type the type of the name is equal to text. And then I will pass required. And it's as simple as that. And I would do the exact same thing for the age and for the color. So for our color, I would go with the option, just required. That's it. And then the same thing for age. So here, age is a number, right? So I will add type here equal number. And then, of course, I will add required. And then save the file, and then when the user tries to fill in this form, he has to fill in each one of the three fields: the name, the color, and the age. And that's it for this tutorial. I'll catch you back in the lesson.